Today we are looking at a game from Ben Finegold. It was a game played in 1984 when Ben Finegold was just 15 years of age, so he was very young here, definitely not a grandmaster yet. In fact, I don't even have his rating for this game. His opponent was 2200, but his rating is missing for whatever reason. So let's jump into the game. Ben Finegold has the white pieces, and he starts with d4, which is one of his favorite openings, his most common opening. And in this position, queen to c2 is a very normal move, trying to defend the knight, overprotect it in view of something like knight to e4, which would add pressure to the knight. And now this move, bishop h4. And after bishop to b4, there's already a lot of pressure on this knight here. So rook to c1 was played in order to defend the knight further. This does, however, give away the a2 pawn. Now, black here did not take and played knight to b6, which I think is simply a mistake. I think taking was totally fine, not only because you're winning the pawn, but I think there's a lot of opportunities here to trade the queens, and if you're up a pawn in a queenless middle game, that's very good. So for example, something like c takes, e takes, and bishop d3, well then bishop takes knight, and after pawn takes, suddenly the queens are being traded off. So I think this would have been something very good for black, but instead of going into this, black simply played knight to b6, trying to get his pieces more active. And also, perhaps one idea is to maneuver the knight to a4, which is definitely reasonable. So bishop to d3, trying to take away some of the pressure on this knight, perhaps by taking one of the attackers. And after bishop to f5, white simply castled, got the king away from this pin, which is the main source of attacking ideas for black in this position, so that makes a lot of sense. And after takes, it's true that white's pawn structure is ruined, but later in the game, you can see that white has a lot of queenside play. The open b file is definitely in white's favor. The possibility of this pawn break with c4 is also something that white should keep in mind, and even though this pawn and this pawn are temporarily weak, they have a lot of possibilities, right? a4, a5, a6, or c4 and either taking or c5. There's a lot of play left on the queen side that white really controls right now. So after queen to a4, looking to trade queens, well, white keeps the queens on the board, and I think this is a good trade. I think this is a good idea, because after takes and something like knight takes, well, without the queens, typically these pawns are going to be a little bit harder to get rolling and really do anything useful with them. Typically, if you have something like an isolated pawn or a pawn that could either be very weak or very powerful, you want to keep the queens on the board to support that pawn. So that is why Ben Finegold moved the queen away to e2. Also, maybe looking to swing it over towards the king side. Queen to a3, and now knight to g5. We have h6, a trade of knights, and now pawn takes. And here I think bishop to b1, of course, defending this pawn, allowing the queen to maybe move away from e2. And now castles. Now here queen to h5 I think was a little premature. And this is actually, I think, a very instructive, not mistake, but inaccuracy that white made here. Because you want to get the queen active, you want to start doing something with it, especially because you realize that everything here on the queen side seems to be under control. You want to do something. But here, this simply runs into bishop g6, and now you have to move your queen again. The bishop, you could definitely argue, is better placed here because, first of all, in the previous position, there's always things to worry about, like g4 and g5 maybe, but also here in this new position, the bishop is defended, so it's going to add some less, it's going to remove some stress from black to make sure that there's no tactics with the bishop. So I would say that this was actually a beneficial maneuver for black here, but regardless, this is still definitely a dynamic game. And now we see c4, and this is what I was talking about. This is a weakness, sure, but it can very quickly become a strength if these pawns start rolling. So now the move rook to e6 was played, trying to stack rooks. Rook to d1, queen to a5, queen to e2, simply moving the pieces, realizing the queen's not doing anything on the king side. Let's bring it back, centralize it a little bit, maybe swing it over to the queen side and aid these pawns. And after bishop to h5, this was probably the most critical moment, or not the most, but definitely a very critical moment here in the game. There's a lot of tactical things going on. The bishop attacking multiple pieces. And here, Ben Finegold played f3, which is, of course, the title of this video. I thought it was quite funny that he played this because he always says never to play f3, never to play f6. Of course, he's not being serious when playing this, but I thought it was very interesting to find some games when he does play that. So it makes sense to play f3 here to block the queen and rook, but it's actually not the best move, and it weakens some stuff because after something like pawn takes, you can imagine that this pawn becomes quite weak, especially if the rooks end up doubling. So there is some pressure to deal with here now with white. So a better option is actually a very nice tactical idea, queen to e1. This queen is undefended, so if bishop takes d1, you win the queen here, and if queen takes, you can take back with the piece that's under attack here. So a nice tactical resource, but f3 also reasonable. And after rook moves to e8, now rook to e1, trying to kind of equal out the pressure on the e-file. And now queen to a3, which is indeed a little bit of a mistake. I think black definitely should have given more thought to taking here. Perhaps black did not like this endgame that arises after queen takes. And white materially, I mean, it's a very unbalanced position, and perhaps black feared that there's too much pressure along this diagonal and back rank, but the truth is something like bishop g6 really deals with all the problems, maybe either f6 or f5 as well to give some breathing room for the king. So definitely nothing to be scared of here, and if anything, black is now the one that has quite a lot of targets in this position, especially with the queen. I think practically it's much easier playing this position with the queen side. Especially again when considering all the fact that this king is definitely not safe here, so there's definitely some tactical possibilities. But okay, black decided not to go for this and instead kept the game very similar with a lot of pieces on the board. Now queen to c2, getting out of this e-file pressure, f5, and now f4, locking down the position. I think a very smart choice, stopping black from ever having the ability to really open up the position on their terms. And now making the king side more locked, giving the queen side the opportunity to open up, which really will work in white's favor when you look at the pawn structure here. So queen to b3, offering a trade which would really strengthen white's pawn structure even further. Queen to a6, and now simply a3. I think this is a very smart move, very instructive as well, because this bishop on b1, it's not only that the bishop is a bad piece, but look at the rook. Now it doesn't have the luxury to move to the A and B file. And for that reason, the bishop is really hurting white here on a number of different levels. And so you need to really think, how can we develop it? Well, bishop to c2 blocks the rook's connection over here on c4. And so a3, trying to go bishop a2, which would also put some pressure maybe on the king in the future. So I think definitely a good and wise choice here. The queen dropping back to c2, black and white simply shuffling a little bit until finally black plays b5. And now we see some trade of pawns and piece, the bishops coming off the board. And now bishop to g3 and h5. Black really trying to get counterplay on the king side, realizing that the queen side is going to work in white's favor. And now rook to e2, a very instructive and really nice move. It comes with two purposes. First, giving some more breathing room to the bishop in view of ideas like h4, but also trying to stack rooks and take full control along the c-file. King g6, rook to c2, and indeed white does gain full control on the c-file. And after b4 and pawn takes, there's king to h7, getting away of any sort of checks and tactical ideas that would attack the king where it was on g6. And now rook to a2. Very nice tactical find, pinning the knight, winning the knight. And black really, I mean, when you compare the counterplay that black has to the attack that white has, you can find out that white's attack is much more powerful, because something like h4 here simply does not work. Rook takes knight, you're attacking the queen, which is obviously more important than the bishop, so the queen has to move. And it's true that, well, the rook and queen do now see this g2 square, so maybe moving the bishop is a little bit dangerous, but realizing that this pawn is weak and this pawn is super strong, you can even give back the material with something like this. A very nice find, and now h3, locking down the position on the king side, stopping all of the attacking chances. The rook really had to move, but realizing that, how dangerous this position already is, white instead tries to find any last glimmer of hope with a queen to c1, which would actually be checkmate, so you have to be very careful here because the d1 square is not defended enough. And so here, very nice move, rook to a1. Simply looking to push this pawn in the future and defend any back rank ideas. Now the rook has to move to g6, and now b5, and the pawn will start running down the board in just moments. A little shuffle of pieces, no need to rush in this position, but ultimately this pawn here begins to run down here with b6. And now I think this was a very crucial moment in the endgame, because you have to be comfortable to transform the advantage. So here, you obviously have an advantage with this passed pawn, and I think a lot of people would try to hold on to that. But you need to understand that in this position, it's not really possible. Your rook is attacked, and even if you were somehow able to just maintain the position how it is, you wouldn't really be able to make any progress. I mean, the pawn can't really push while the rook is here. So rook to a7, a beautiful find. And after rook takes, pawn takes, yes, queen to a6 is indeed winning the pawn, but by really moving the queen far away, black is ignoring the king side, and now the simple h4 and h5 decides the game. Black resigned here because there's nothing that black can do. Defending the g6 pawn is useless. Simply queen takes and pawn takes, and this is a winning endgame. Something like g4 maybe, and after f takes, the king comes in, and even d5 here. Very nice pawn harmony here. The king has to move, and simply king takes here. You get the rest of the picture here. It's definitely game over. So really beautiful endgame played here. Understanding that the queen side is where white is strong, we need to add pressure there, stacking the rooks on the c-file, and really going all out on this queenside attack. Thank you for watching. Hopefully you found this video educational and this game really instructive. Subscribe if you're new around here, and I will see you next time. Peace out.